All right, so today we have Dr. Ryan Martin, anger researcher, associate dean at UWGB, psychology professor, author of a book called Why We Get Mad and How to Use Your Anger for Positive Change. Definitely suggest checking it out, giving it a read. Gives a lot of insight to not only why we get mad and the usefulness of the emotion, but also how to use that for, like the title says, for positive change, allowing it to fuel a drive or some kind of goal that you might have in that connection with that emotion. I actually had the opportunity to have Dr. Ryan Martin for a professor for abnormal psychology. It was online because it was still in COVID, but I learned a lot from his class, and I'm hoping that the conversation that we have today will shine some light on a little bit more to the expression of anger, and how it affects the world of addiction and recovery. So yeah, thank you again, Ryan, for agreeing to chat with me. Why don't you tell, I find this interesting, the listeners to this discussion, a little bit about why you got into anger research and why it intrigues you so much.
Yeah, you bet. And first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for having me. I love the opportunity to talk to people like this, and it's also just awesome to see former students doing so well and doing great things out in the world, which you are. So that's awesome to get a chance to talk to you again. So I started studying anger officially, I would argue, in 1999 when I went to graduate school. I started my PhD program at the University of Southern Mississippi. But I would say unofficially, I was studying anger way before that, right? Because I grew up in what I would describe as an angry home. And whenever I say that, I'm worried that people will sort of jump to the conclusion that it wasn't a loving home, or that we didn't get along, or that we fought all the time. That wasn't it at all. We're actually all very close still, 40 plus years later. But we had, I had a dad who has since passed away, but I had a dad who was, by his own admission and by most people's admission, an angry guy. He didn't usually take it out on us, but he was relatively impatient in the world, and he would get angry at wait staff or gas station attendants, or probably his coworkers and things like that. And so I just kind of grew up witnessing this sort of thing a lot. So much so that people would refer to it sometimes as the Martin temper, referring to, mostly the males in our family having a bit of a temper. And then when I was in college, so prior to going to Southern Miss, I was at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, and I worked at a shelter for at-risk adolescents. And kind of putting at risk in quotes there. And these were kids who had struggled with sometimes various reasons for why they were there. Had struggled with the legal system, had struggled with foster care placements, things like that. But what I noticed about many of them is that there was this tendency for them to kind of lose their temper, to fly off the handle a little bit. I think what I know now that I didn't know adequately then is that these were kids who had a lot to be angry about. The world had not treated them fairly. They had were suffering in all sorts of ways that had nothing to do with them, and they were understandably angry. I think they still oftentimes had challenges controlling that anger, but I suspect most children would at that point. But all of that sort of led me to want to study this. And so I went to graduate school and had the good fortune to work with a guy named Dr. Eric Dahlin, who is an anger researcher still at Southern Miss and still a good friend and colleague. And that's where it all started, I guess.
All right, awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, definitely go into a lot more in the book. So that's why I encourage people to grab that in understanding the topic that you study. I pulled a quote from your book. It is not okay to be mad. It is sometimes right to be mad. In fact, the reason you even feel anger in the first place is because it served your ancestors so very well. It helped not just to keep them alive, but also to thrive in what was often an exceedingly difficult and cruel world. It can serve the same purpose for you now. End quote. So yeah, I guess, and where I'd like to kind of point this discussion here today is, in the world of recovery, I guess more specifically, I talk to people, whether it's the recovering addict themselves or the family members, like everybody is angry, and I'm seeing more and more that a lot of people don't know what to do with that anger. They can pick up a book. I can suggest something to read, have a thoughtful conversation with them. It doesn't seem to alleviate the struggle that they have. I feel that it's continuous and ongoing. Because when I always know that like we get angry at our loved ones for the most part even more, because whether it's an expectation or we just care so much that we want the best for them, and get upset about various things when we see them off the path. So I guess with that in mind, I'm kind of curious to your thoughts about how you want to motivate someone or encourage someone that's dealing with a loved one, someone who's angry at the choices that their son, their daughter, their husband, or their wife is making, and whether it's in respects to education or whatever that may look like. So how do you see the beginnings of that conversation going? What would you suggest to someone who has a loved one that's an addict?
Yeah, I think there's a lot there in what you said, and so I'm sort of putting it all together in my mind as far as how to respond. And I think one of the things I would say is, I guess I would start from a very, very basic statement about emotion in general, even more generally than anger, which is to say, when we feel things, it's our brain and our body's way of communicating something to us, right? And this is true of everything. If I feel fear, it means that I might be in danger. If I feel guilt, it means I might have done something wrong, right? And this is a way that our brain lets us know there's a problem and gives us some additional motivation to solve that problem. So in the case of anger, to go back to that quote, our anger exists because it let us know, hey, you may have been wronged, and then it gave us the energy to confront that injustice, to deal with that, the way in which we might have been wronged, right? And so I think that the piece that's really important there, though, is I guess there's a couple of elements that are really important to think about. One is, unlike a lot of other emotions, anger is what we oftentimes refer to as a social emotion, meaning it occurs most frequently in relationships or in interactions with other people, at least. And so when I get mad, sometimes it's going to be at myself. In fact, a lot of times it'll be at myself. That's when it's not a social emotion. But a lot of times it's with some other being in the world, right? And sometimes it's a one-off interaction with another driver or someone I meet in the hallway. Sometimes, though, it's a more complicated interaction with the person I have a long-standing relationship with, right? It's a partner, it's a sibling, it's a parent, it's a coworker, it's a roommate, it's a friend, whatever. It's a person that I've had this relationship with. So in those cases, it is obviously more complicated, and it is also, it isn't, the anger isn't the only emotion I've got going on there, right? I might also be feeling sad. I might also be feeling guilty. I might also be feeling scared, you know, and feeling all of these things, frankly, in some ways, sort of on their, not on their behalf, but in defense of them, right? And so if I've got someone I care about deeply who is an addict, and I'm getting angry about their the choices they're making, I'm also feeling maybe sad for them. I'm also probably feeling scared for them, and also scared for me and what this might mean for our relationship and so on. Maybe I'm feeling guilty because I'm wishing I could do more, but also understanding that, well, maybe there's things I can't do. All of this is like this giant emotional bubbly mess that makes it hard to engage in these circumstances. A few things I would say. First is I would encourage people to spend time unpacking those feelings. Before you actually interact with the person, or on your own, unpack those feelings to get a sense for, what does this mean, that I'm feeling all of these different ways? Where are these feelings coming from? And the answer is they might not be coming exclusively from that other person, right? They might be coming, they may be things that you're bringing to the table too. And so unpack that, try and do a deep dive in yourself to get a feel for where that stuff's coming from. The other piece is, as much of a cliche as this is and sounds, is that people have to remember that they can't control other people. They can do their best to motivate other people. They can do their best to set boundaries, and they can have these conversations, but ultimately other people's choices are their own. And so you have to, on some level, be able to work through kind of what role you play in this situation, and knowing that you aren't necessarily, at a certain point, you may have to give up that control, which brings with it a whole bunch of other emotions and concerns and fears.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me, I guess, of the complexity that is involved, that it's not always just the focal point of the area, the anger itself, that it involves so much more. And what I heard as well is that it's not just the anger towards that person, that it can be internalized, that we're bringing something to the table. And I guess more importantly with that note is that we really should be unpacking that, figuring out where it comes from. Yeah, no, thank you for that. I guess along the same lines, is I guess the point of stigma within the community. I meet a lot of people that are frustrated, are just, and they feel that shame in the recovery. And this is the point where, we need to definitely lift up this individual, to encourage their goals and to figure out that aiming point. I always like bringing up, was it a Russian neuroscientist, Sokolov, describes the orienting reflex and how the world kind of shapes itself to that said goal. And then in combination to how the world reacts, there's a fun physics experiment that they do. It's a double slit experiment where the essentially what happens with the photon
Mhm.
is randomized, and then it has that set random pattern, if you want to call it that. But then if you're not looking at it, it changes things and it becomes not random. So the
Hmm.
whole premise of the experiment is that the the result or the experiment changes when it's not being observed, which I
Right.
find just quite interesting. It might be opposite in its effect to
Mhm.
Sokolov's findings, but it speaks to how the universe presents itself, I think, in a sort of way.
Mhm.
Um, and you know, in probably a not so beautiful segue, um, back to the thoughts and experiences that addicts have in their recovery journey. Um, I guess I'm curious to know how you'd encourage someone who has that anger from what's presented in society, in the community, because there will always be those that, whether it be naivety or just their own anger about addicts themselves and the behavior. What you tell the addict trying to recover in dealing with their own anger issues, that definitely include that shame piece. What is your encouraging note, or what would you like to extend to that?
Yeah, I think um the the shame piece and the way in which anger and sort of interacts with other emotions is always really fascinating to me. And you've probably sensed this from some other conversations we've had, and things I've shared, that there's a lot of people who describe anger as this secondary emotion, right? That it exists from, there's something else going on. And I don't believe that anger is inherently secondary. And I think we've got tons of evidence to suggest that it's not inherently secondary. That said, I think it can be, just like any emotion can be secondary, in that there might be something else going on. Now, one interesting finding I had discovered relatively recently is I was surveying people and I asked, who do you get angry at most often? And the most common answer was not what I was expecting. Almost half of people said the number one source of their anger was themselves. That they were angry at themselves, and that essentially these what I'll call, or what have been called, self-directed shoulds, like I should do X, Y, and Z. And then when I don't do X, Y, and Z, I get mad. And that was really driving a lot of their anger and frustration day to day, which is pretty similar to this concept of shame, right? This concept of guilt, maybe, that I'm unhappy with what I've done in my existence in the world and the decisions I've made. One of the things I try to encourage people to do who are experiencing lots of guilt or shame or kind of disappointment in themselves is to, it comes down to that similar to what we said before about not being able to control other people. You also can no longer control who you were in the past. The part you can control is who you are from this moment forward. And to me, I've often found it really empowering to sort of consider a day of a reset, to say, you know what, it doesn't matter. I mean, yes, I'm still living with maybe the bad decisions I made over the weekend or 2 weeks ago or a year ago or whatever. I'm still living with some of those bad decisions, but I'm also making new decisions to try and address where I go from here. The other thing I try to remind myself is, at the time that I made those decisions or those choices, even though I regret them now, I made them for a reason. That who I was at the time that I made them came from somewhere. And I maybe they weren't bad decisions. Maybe they were just where, I mean, or I mean, maybe they were, but maybe they were just who and what I was at the time. And I was facing all sorts of pressures at that time when I made those decisions, societal pressures, family, whatever. I had all this stuff going on. And this is what I did. And yeah, I can regret that. But I can also acknowledge that where I am now is a different place. Who I am now is a different person. And I can move forward in a different way. And doesn't mean I'm not facing the consequences, doesn't mean I'm not disappointed in myself. It just means I am someone different right now, moving forward.
Awesome. So what I heard at the end there is the ability to give yourself some grace.
Yeah,
Or some
absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, again, all these things sound a little bit cliched, and I get that, but people have a habit of talking about themselves and describing themselves and judging themselves in ways they would never be as hostile to others, right? I mean, my internal monologue is oftentimes so much meaner than anything I would ever say to another human being. And so there is something to that, this idea that we can sort of cut ourselves the same slack we might be willing to give other people, and be a little bit patient with ourselves, understand and be forgiving over decisions we made. But also, I do think at the same time, it's okay to have high expectations for who you are right now.
Sure.
And say, yeah, you know what, I'm this isn't my way of excusing myself or making excuses for the decisions I make today. It's my way of forgiving past me and being on board with and supportive of current me.
Well, yeah. Forgiveness. And yeah, I like that. I guess just as we're talking, about the emotions and, anger and everything that comes along with, I see the importance of, getting back to the basics, just with people in general, whether that be, one-on-one or group settings, and discussing these things, like, verbalizing what's going in our head. I think to understand as a point of reflection, because I heard a little bit on reflection as you were talking as well. And, also akin to what you were saying, one of the authors that I enjoy reading, he'll oftentimes say, treat yourself as though you're responsible for caring for that person.
Mm-hmm.
Like treat yourself as the friend, and really pick up that responsibility, so to say, because you are worth it. Now, you dive into, I guess, immense amounts of self-doubt, shame, and a myriad of other emotions when you're working in the recovery community. I can speak to this very plainly because I was an addict myself for the better part of a decade, to heroin, opiates, after a couple surgeries that I had to fix my shoulder from my time in service, and then also prior to that being engulfed in alcohol during my early 20s. But yeah, it's a real struggle, and I see it's been even more real with the times, God forbid I mentioned COVID again. I feel like we're over this, but
we want to be.
There was such seclusion, and the new norm became, don't go out in society, when that was probably the biggest influencer to how people need people to recover because
Mhm.
we aren't strong enough. And, really, really understanding that need to encourage those. Um, but again, I'm going off track. I always go on these little tangents.
That's all right. No, I've had a few thoughts as you were talking through some of that. And the first is just related to the COVID piece. I remember early on, it was intended as a joke and I thought it was funny, but then there was maybe a little too much truth to it. But early on, and maybe in the first month there, so April of 2020, Conan O'Brien, I think, tweeted out something to the effect of, hey, so we're going to raise the threshold on alcoholism, right? And, there's a sense of, look, everybody's drinking more right now. Everybody's using more. And I think it sort of speaks to what you're saying, which is, look, this is an exceedingly stressful time and people are going to cope with it in potentially in unhealthy ways, and we need to acknowledge that not all coping mechanisms are great for people. And there's some truth to that. The other thing I was thinking too, and this sort of comes from what you were saying, but also what we were talking about even before that is, I worry sometimes that when people try to explain past behavior, it ends up coming across as an excuse. It's like, hey, the reason, and not just for substance use, but for anything, right? The reason why I overate this weekend, or the reason why I didn't exercise yesterday is because, and I worry that because whatever the answer to those questions is, or whatever the answer to those statements is comes across as sounding like, yeah, I'm just making excuses for why I overate, or why I didn't work out, or why I used, or why I was unfaithful, or whatever the thing is. And that might be what's happening, but also that's how you figure out how to avoid it in the future. The solution to any unhealthy behavior is not to just quote unquote be stronger. That might be part of it, but it's also to figure out what the circumstances were that led to that behavior, and then take steps to avoid those, and take steps to address those things. And so if the reason why, I think in terms of too often people, I think they hear someone say, hey, look, the reason why I was a user back then is because of X, Y, and Z. And then people think, well, you're just making excuses, blah, 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 blah. But that's not really it. It's about trying to say, hey, these were the forces in my life that led to this. And in order for me to be successful moving forward, I have to sort of deal with those and come up with alternatives to those things, address those forces. And I think that's really important. And it's similarly important with anger. Anger isn't just, too often, I think people think that dealing with their anger, dealing with any negative emotion is just about sort of managing it after the fact. But that's not really true. It's about managing it in advance. It's about understanding, okay, these are the circumstances in which I tend to get angry and or experience any strong emotion. So let's address some of those circumstances. Are there some steps I can take prior to the provocation that'll help me manage it more successfully? And I think that ties in, knowing that negative emotions are one of the predictors of substance use, dealing with those negative emotions. And by the way, I should put negative emotions in quotes, because I don't necessarily mean that the emotions are negative, but I think they feel negative to people sometimes. And dealing with those emotions can be an important preventer of later use.
Sure. Yeah. And, that definitely speaks to how we are treating, at least in the CBT realm of addiction, is understanding what thoughts were the precursor to use, or what complexity of thoughts, what event led to this thinking or that, and understanding that the thoughts led to the behavior and the relapse or the lapse.
Yep.
But yeah, I guess something I guess I'd like to discuss also. I think this was a recent research experiment that came out. You remember when you know the rooms came out where you like anger rooms and you could go
Yeah.
in and like bash things and tear apart things, and then years later there was the research that came out where, hey, maybe that's not so healthy.
Yeah. Yep.
So what would be, I guess, the activities, or how do we want to redirect when we become angry? Now that we figured out, we've assessed that we're angry, where do we take that? Where do we go from there?
Yeah. So you know what, the rage rooms, which have been for a while sort of all the rage, have really taken off. And I get the sense that maybe they're dying down a little bit now, but they really took off for a while there. And they're rooted in something we have known for a while is not necessarily a good way to deal with your anger, and that's catharsis, right? And that ultimately, and the problem is, and this ends up being an issue with lots of emotional problems, is that they end up feeling really good to people, right? It feels good in the moment to do this thing. And because it feels good in the moment, people think that it works, right? And so, and now, as you know, as well as anyone, there's lots of things that feel good in the moment that doesn't necessarily mean it's good for you, right? And so if I said, yes, my go-to anger management strategy is smoking a cigarette or getting drunk or overeating or whatever, I mean, those things would obviously not be good for me over time. And the same thing is true here, that we find that people who engage in that sort of catharsis end up being more aggressive, more hostile, more angry, and expressing their anger in more maladaptive ways. So what are the alternatives then? What can we do? And this is a thing that I think is just so important, because in the grand scheme of things, one of the biggest problems we seem to have as a society, honestly, is we haven't built up in ourselves enough tools to deal effectively with our emotions. We don't have enough strategies. I recently heard something, this was actually pretty heartbreaking to me, and I'm gonna try and find ways to deal with it. But someone said to me recently on social media, essentially said, look, if this thing that you're describing doesn't work, then I'm out of options. And basically said, like, if what you're telling me is that I can't use this successfully, then I don't know what else to do. And that statement makes me sad, because there are 50 other things to do. And I'm not blaming that person for not knowing this. Far from it. I think this person was just never given the tools, like most people, to deal effectively with emotions. And so what are some of those tools? So it depends on what stage of the emotion we want to intervene, because when it comes to an emotion, there's a stimulus, a thing that quote unquote caused it. There's you mentioned CBT earlier. There's the thoughts we have when we experience that stimulus. There's the mood we were in when we experienced that stimulus. There's the feeling itself, like the actual physiological feeling in our bodies. And then there's what we do with it. And we can look at that whole train, pretending life is as linear as that is for a second, and we can identify interventions for every step of the way. So I can start by, maybe I choose not to engage in particular types of provocations. Maybe I say, you know what, I'm going to block so-and-so on social media because their content drives me crazy. It makes me mad and I don't want to deal with it. Right. And so I'm now avoiding that provocation. It's an easy day to say this since the Packers won last night, but for those people who get angry over Packer losses, you can choose whether or not you engage in watching. This is blasphemy in Wisconsin, but in whether or not you watch the Packers, right? These are choices you make. The same way I don't really watch scary movies anymore, because I know they make me scared and I don't necessarily want to feel that way. That's a thing you can do. You can think about the thoughts you're having. You can pay attention to, when am I, engaging in self-directed or other directed shoulds? When am I catastrophizing? When am I labeling people, and so on and so on and so on. You can take better care of yourself. So, you're eating right, you're staying hydrated, and you're getting a good night's sleep. You're less likely to get angry in those moments. You can, in the moment when you're angry, you can take deep breaths, you can engage in meditation or grounding, various strategies to try and decrease the physiological feeling of anger. And then after all that's done, you can think about how you tend to express your anger. You can channel it into something pro-social and productive, instead of yelling at someone or swearing at someone or giving someone the finger or whatever, right? I mean, these are all of these different strategies you can use, and we can intervene all sorts of ways all across that train to try and so, from a big picture perspective, I think everything I just said about anger, there's a variation of it that could be used for guilt, for sadness, for fear. We can use these tools to modify our moods effectively in these ways.
Right. Yeah. No, I guess that mindfulness is what I pick up on, and that reflection and the choice to do something different. It's like you talk about a lot in your TED Talks, and also in your book, about if you wanted to create the most frustrating or angry situation, you would invent, the driving system, our highways, our
Yep.
city streets, roundabouts. That it's all there for you to produce this thing called anger. And yeah, so instead of, flipping someone off, maybe taking a moment, all right, maybe let's try something else. Maybe let's try breathing.
Yeah.
Maybe let's listen to music, something like that. And, using that as a stepping point to maybe different thought processes in different realms. What I'm finding through addiction and through the trauma research that I've been doing is that, gosh, everything is connected, and nothing should be left unaccounted for. The root is normally deep. And that makes things difficult too, especially, when you're trying to research these things. It's just like, gosh, well, now that I'm looking at this, now I need to look at this and understand this. I'm sure it's driven all of my professors in the past crazy, because I have so many questions. And I can tell, I used to bug Georgina just all the time, like whether it be the weekend, I'd be emailing her, hey, what is this? And she's always there to answer my questions.
There are worse things in the world than being curious, that's for sure. Speaking of another emotion out there with a positive impact, right? There's curiosity is a great thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe I'm a little too curious. I always have this underlying worry, I guess, that I changed addictions from, using all the time, to now I'm jumping on and I'm reading my psychological assessment book at 6 a.m. or at 4 a.m. I'm just like, gosh, I can't waste time. Where normally in the rage of my addiction, so to say, it was waking up using just to be normal for that day. And I think that's a lot of what gets misinterpreted in the world out there is that I think I came across the statistic that 80% of users don't use to get high, and they actually have normal everyday jobs, white collar jobs, and a wide range of employment opportunities, and that it's not a problem. The only thing that I've found is, self-soothing and finding that alternate route to your suffering or whatever you're using for, is that it's not healthy and it will cause issues.
Mhm.
In the beginning of my addiction, my drug dealer was my doctor. For 9 years of my addiction, I would go, hey, I'm not feeling good. I can't walk around, or I'm having trouble sleeping. All right, well, we need to up your dose.
Mhm.
Oh, okay, that's the fix. All right, I like that because I know it makes me feel good.
Mhm.
So, I mean, that would, and it combined too, because I guess my issue and my anger towards the end of my own addiction, it was confused with, well, hey, if I'm getting my pills, my form of alleviation through a doctor, how could I be? And this person has umpteen numbers of years in school, and they know best, sort of thing. And I knew in my last year that I was going down a a very destructive path, so to say. And having those old thoughts where, hey, this is okay, because I mean, in my last year of where it really got spiraled out and messy, that's when I started going to alternate routes other than the doctor, because I couldn't fulfill my need from my doctor because of the new legislation. And it's just like I had these new I don't know if you'd call them axioms of thought, but I mean, they stemmed off of the original ones, that it's okay because it's basically the same thing. I would talk myself into, hey, relative,
Right.
thoughts, and just a bleeding path, which I mean would ultimately drag me into being incarcerated in December of 2017. And I actually didn't get out until July of 2020. So I mean, anger, I could probably go on for years talking about the people that I've talked to in prison and jail, and
Right.
just the situations. And it's sad, really, that I mean, you speak of appropriate uses of anger and reflection. I mean, all these things are learned things through supportive and knowledgeable relationships that a lot of the guys that I spent time with never were witness to.
Right.
A healthy relationship, never were witness to an alternate route other than using to dull what they were going through, whether that be happy or sad or angry or whatever it is. But
Right.
yeah, we've hit that 9:15 mark. So I'd like to thank you for coming on. I hope we can call on you for more questions.
Please. Yeah.